socio-political books related to India and the contemporary global importance. So far, we have produced around 192 videos. Of them, 35 videos are live book discussions, both launching of the books and the book discussions. Socio-political books related to India and the contemporary. The remaining are pre-recorded versions of the brief book introductions that spanning from 15 to 15 minutes to half an hour like this. I request all the viewers to subscribe to this channel, which aimed at promoting books and book discussions. In continuation to our activity, today we are discussing about history and class consciousness, written by Hungarian philosopher, communist, Marxist philosopher. For a brief time, he also worked as a Minister for Education and Culture in Hungary. Actually, April 13th was his birth anniversary. We tried to have this event on April 13th, but because of the preferred choice of dates by the speakers, presenters, we are meeting today. Recently, you must be aware, this George Lucas statue has been removed from Hungary's Central Park, and it was replaced by the founder of the modern Hungary. So, removing statues, removing books, or burning progressive literature is not only confined to the Asian countries like India or something. It's happened earlier, and it's happening now. This is the one important aspect we need to keep in mind. Coming back to this book, the History and Class Consciousness is a collection of articles written by George Lucas himself for a period of, or a span of about 15 to 20 years. He himself suggests in his new introduction in 1967, how his idea of Marxism, the idea of dialectics, evolved over the period of time, both internal, while engaging in internal struggle and also the external struggle. So it has a kind of a foundational book with reference to Western Marxism. It has a great influence for the European scholars. So this is the first collection of the publication was came out in 1923. We are in 2023. It is 100 years of the publication of the book. So we thought of organizing this event. I contacted actually Ricardo Antunes, a professor from Sao Paulo. He was engaged otherwise, so he suggested Dr. Victor Strazzeri. So I thank you, Victor Strazzeri, for accepting our invitation. Victor Strazzeri is a professor by birth. He is Brazilian. He born in Sao Paulo. Now he is teaching across the universities in Europe. His PhD thesis is titled Max Weber and German Social Democracy in Study of Relationship between a liberal bourgeoisie and the labor movement in Imperial Germany. The period he studied is in 1882 and 1899. That is an interesting book, and he took classes on various issues across the universities. Welcome, Victor, on behalf of Manchi Pustakam. I requested Professor Purerndra Prasad to preside over this event. Purerndra Prasad is a noted public intellectual, sociologist by profession, is working in Hyderabad Central University. And also I requested Comrade Sitaram Yechury, is known, he doesn't require any new introduction. He is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of India Marxist, a two-term parliamentarian, is a voracious reader and writer, and one of the few Marxist intellectuals. I welcome you all. Purerndra Garu, I request you to take over the session.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Veeraya Garu.
I'm not Professor.
Yeah, especially I think I congratulate and really appreciate Manchi Pustakam initiative to actually generate this kind of a discussion on classics and classics which are very relevant to current times. And I'm really happy that you invited me to be part of this discussion, which is the centenary celebration. And in fact, in India, in most of the universities and of course outside, one of the main question that is also going on is about class. How relevant is Marxian class in understanding Indian contemporary context and contemporary situation? Of course, I think there is no one kind of an answer, but I think it actually requires a lot of students to go back to reading and rereading Marx and a lot of classics. And George Lukács' classic history and class consciousness is one of the very important texts. That provides the basis for a lot of these provocative kind of thoughts. How do we understand dialectics? How do we understand historical materialism? What is class? What is class consciousness? How do we understand class relations in historical times? In fact, Lukács' book starts with the famous statement that Marx actually made in terms of his thesis on Feuerbach. Okay. That philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. From there, it begins to actually explain the significance of class and how theory, becomes a material force when it grips the masses. But the challenging question here is how do we, translate that kind of, theory that is gripping the masses and how that translates into class and class relations. Okay, so it was this kind of a historical kind of a condition that actually constitutes the basis for us to, understand what is the historical function of theory. How do we derive actually method from a particular kind of a context? Okay. So this is where I think when we need to understand class relations, class consciousness, one needs to be careful in terms of, going back to the historical conditions of each of the nation rather than a general kind of a given European condition. And in that sense, we had huge, massive discussions in terms of understanding Indian capitalism, particularly mode of production debate that happened in India, after mode of production debate today in terms of both agrarian question and urban question, how both are relevant in trying to, explain the class and class consciousness. Okay. I'm sure, I think Victor Straza and Comrade Sitaram Yechury are also going to highlight a lot of these, ideas, insights, that actually would be helpful to provoke not only to read the classics, but also to make sense of those ideas to our contemporary context. So I'm looking forward to the presentation by both Victor Straza and the discussion by Comrade Sitaram Yechury. And now I'll hand over it to Victor Straza.
Thank you so much, Purerndra. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, so I will put my presentation on the screen. And can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so just a second. All right. Just so I don't miss out on the time. Okay, I'll be speaking for about 40-45 minutes. First of all, I want to take thank Veraya for the invitation. And it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here and talk about this book with this audience in particular, and with an audience in India and other places. While this book is connected to Western Marxism, I mean, the concept that Perry Anderson coined in the 70s, the reception of history and class consciousness has very much been a global one. And indeed, at least where I come from Brazil, this was being read before even the concept of Western Marxism emerged. And so the fact that we're here either from India or Brazil is not so much an atypical, but a very traditional, let's say, a very orthodox configuration to read Georg Lukács's work. So let's start, just like Professor Prasad was saying, this is not a book about capitalism in general or the working class in an abstract sense. This is very much a book that emerges out of a very concrete situation, and also attempts to give us instruments to analyze reality in precisely that manner, not abstractly, not in a generic, much less Eurocentric fashion. So, in trying to figure out how I was going to present this, I thought about this metaphor for history and class consciousness. You'll see HCC in my presentation. History and class consciousness is like a river with many tributaries. I mean, there are many, many streams that flow into the trajectory of Lukács that to give rise to this book. And so there are also just as many ways to approach it in an analysis at its centennial. And so Lukács has engaged, by the time Lukács wrote History and Class Consciousness, he had engaged with almost every aspect of modern European philosophy, also classical philosophy, and you can detect both classical German idealism or the contemporary trends of philosophy of his time. All of them are detectable in this work, and where I think is something I'm not going to do. I'm not going to take my little boat and go up any of these rivers. What I'm going to try and do, and I won't be speaking about the reception that much either. I will. So how it's read in Brazil and in India, all of these things are very much presentations into themselves. What I'll do is concentrate, let's say, on the great geological markers that gave that immense flow of knowledge production its distinguishing characteristics. So what are the historical kind of conditions that specifically contributed to Lukács producing this work in that time, and what is Lukács's own, individual intellectual personality and contribution in this, so that we don't only stay with this panorama. So instead of just, what are all these rivers, all the tributaries that flow into history and class consciousness, and where does it flow? What is the contribution that it itself gives to other forms of thought in its global reception? I'm going to concentrate more on the context and the situated nature of the production of this work in the 1920s in Western Europe. So here we go. Just a little consideration of the trajectory of Lukács until the production of History and Class Consciousness. He's born in, as Veraya was saying, April 13th, 1885. In Budapest, it's still Austria-Hungary. So we should always take the consideration that Lukács is an author of Western Marxism with a grain of salt already from this standpoint, because he is very much in the periphery of Western Europe. If you can, it's not Western Europe at the time. Austria-Hungary is a much more complex combination of East, West, North and South, I would say. So that's already an element that we have to keep in mind. Capitalism is even more, let's say, even less developed in Budapest or in in Hungary as part of Austria-Hungary at that time. It's in a way a periphery of the German-speaking world, and Lukács speaks from the standpoint of that periphery. We should not forget that, even though he is bilingual German and Hungarian. So he studies law, but he quickly turns to aesthetic questions in his early 20s. And here I want to divide his trajectory in 3 phases. If we start, let's say, his first and most important book is called Soul and Form. He published it in the late noughts, so in 1908 in Hungarian, in 1911 in German. This book gave him already, it's a collection of essays, gave him already some notoriety, and this led him to move to Heidelberg to continue working on aesthetics and be in that situation. He came into direct contact with Max and Mariana Weber. He frequented their home, and that's, I'm going to call that first phase the phase of forms in life. Lukács was never really a disengaged philosopher. He always posed ethical questions. He was always interested in the relationship between life and forms, life and concepts, aesthetic works, and life experiences, etc. I won't go into this. This is a whole other presentation. But again, even at that point, he was concerned with how concepts and how forms relate to life and existence. But this is still being raised in a very abstract form here. So I would put this phase as between spring 1912 and summer 1914. This is the moment that he's in Heidelberg. He doesn't conclude any work that he starts in this period, and his academic career also because he's already seen as too critical, and also because he's a Jewish intellectual, his pathway into German academia and Imperial Germany then is already very complicated. So, of course, this period is interrupted not by an individual event, but by a collective catastrophe. And that's the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, which hits Lukács very powerfully. And Lukács was never a part of the enthusiasm that overtook German intelligentsia and the intelligentsia of other countries. He rejected the war from the start. And that's also the moment where he produces the theory of the novel, and where he starts his transition to Hegel from a more Kantian or Kierkegaardian form of thought. Of course, in this period we also have the Russian Revolution, which opens up new possibilities, and most important of all, in November 1918, you have both the collapse of Austria-Hungary, which is termed as the Chrysanthemum Revolution, and the November Revolution that puts an end to Imperial Germany. So these events, starting with the war and ending with revolution, they produce a transformation in Lukács that will produce the conditions that will lead to history and class consciousness. And here I have a quote from Lukács himself. He says, "Clearly my rejection of the war, and with it of bourgeois society of the time, was purely utopian. Not even at the level of the most abstract intellection were there any mediations between my subjective attitude and objective reality." So the subjective rejection and the objective reality of catastrophe, there were no mediations between them. And I want you to remember this word mediation. It will be important for the presentation. So a third phase begins. This phase begins in December 1918. Lukács joins the Hungarian Communist Party, becomes a Marxist, and his first few Marxist texts emerge very shortly after. The collection Tactics and Ethics is one of the first Marxist publications that we'll have. It's already a few months after this conversion, let's say. I don't like the word conversion. This adhesion, because people love to say this is kind of a religious experience for Lukács. I radically disagree with this. It's a very clear, conscious political decision that matures from all of these events that I was just describing just now. So in this new revolutionary phase, Lukács will actually participate in a revolution in Hungary. as Virai was also saying, which is a short-lived one from March to August 1919, and he will spend the rest of his time until the until he finished History in Class Consciousness in exile in Vienna. This is very important. The big break between the phase before and this one is not only the fact that he's now a member of a communist party and a self-professed Marxist, but Lukács is no longer an observer of all these events. He's no longer just experiencing them. He's intervening in them very, very actively. He's in the middle of everything. The fact that he joins this movement and becomes part of a revolution testifies to this. And this is the key element of the production of History in Class Consciousness. Not just a context, not just a change in the way of in Lukács's thinking, but the fact that he becomes an active subject in all of this context. All right, let's take a look at how History in Class Consciousness is a very peculiar book. So I just wanted us to take a short look at how it's structured. It's an essay collection, but a coherent one. So on the left side, you see the genesis of the essays. What is the order in which they emerged? And on the right, you see the sequence that they appear in the book. So Lukács changes the sequence, and more than that, he says in the introduction he wrote to the book in 1922 that precisely in the sequence is where the coherence of all of these different pieces come together. So he very much recommends we read it in order, which is seldom done. Usually we only read History in Class Consciousness piecemeal. We read the verification chapter, and which is exactly the one he says we should do last, which is because it's the most complicated. It's very similar to Capital, where you have Marx saying, the first few chapters will be difficult if you don't have a certain philosophical training. Maybe you should leave them to the end. And what actually the reception has done is read that first, and sometimes only read that, which is exactly the opposite of what they would wanted us to do. The same phenomenon appears with History in Class Consciousness. What's important is all of the essays that come before 1921, he heavily reworks, right? So he doesn't just take them into History in Class Consciousness. He reworks them very radically. I mean, Historical Materialism, Change of Function is almost 2/3 is longer. What is Orthodox Marxism? The famous opening essay is also heavily reworked. And so this points to him having produced this, especially from the end of 1921 until the end of 1922. And this is important because Lukács had just lost Lukács's faction, let's say, in the Hungarian Communist Party, had been defeated by October 1921. And so this is the moment that he leaves the Central Committee of the Hungarian Party and dedicates himself to this book. So the book is written in a context of personal defeat, but also in a context where the revolution does not seem to be just around the corner. There are things blocking the revolution. That's what he wants to understand with this book. And what the fact that he revised the essays reveals is the fact that, what it provides us is a basis of comparison for Lukács's own development. If we take What is Orthodox Marxism, written for Tactics and Ethics before the revolution in Hungary, so before March 1919, and we take the version that it went into the book, so from late 2022, comparing them can give us an insight into his own development in this period. Lukács is in constant development, not only because he's just, in a way, turned to Marxism, but because the development will also not stop with History in Class Consciousness. It will continue throughout the 1920s with different twists and turns, and then later into his life. So this is also what I'm going to do in the presentation. The presentation is going to be structured around the political stakes and the scope of History in Class Consciousness. So what are the goals? What are the main goals of this work? What is he trying to achieve? But above all, what are the political stakes behind this work? Because this work has a very clear political genesis. And so, what do I mean by the scope of history and class consciousness? This is an extraordinarily complex book that has 100 different themes and ways to approach it. I tried here to simplify a little bit, but in a way that I hope is helpful to everyone who's listening. So Lukács, as his opening essay announces, attempts to return to the source, what he calls orthodox Marxism, a return to the writings of Marx and Engels themselves, but also to Hegel and their relationship to Hegel. And he does this for what I'm calling 3 interrelated recoveries, and I'm going to approach each one of them in the presentation. He wants to recover the dialectic in Marxism. Marxism had fallen prey to kind of positivistic, formalistic perspectives during the time of the Second International, so from the late 19th century to the First World War. He also wants to recover the revolutionary aspect of the dialectic, and finally, the centrality of praxis as the lever that makes Marxist dialectics revolutionary. So he wants to recover the dialectic in Marxism, the revolutionary character of the dialectic, and the role of praxis, the central role of praxis for Marxist dialectics. In terms of the political stakes, in early 1919, Lukács is most focused in a critique of what he calls opportunism. I mean, this is the end of the war. This is the aftermath of the November Revolution in 1918, of the downfall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course, the mass social democratic parties were powerless to stop the outbreak of the war. And what Lukács is experiencing in early 1919, when he writes the first of these essays, is Rosa Luxemburg has just been murdered, of course, and the Spartacus uprising in Germany has been defeated. So this is very much fresh in his mind, and that's where he's focusing his critical effort to. And I'll go into that in detail, or in some detail. But the political stakes in late 1922 were different, because the Hungarian Revolution has just taken place and has been defeated. Lukács is also much more aware that for the communist revolutions to have any perspective of success elsewhere beyond what's becoming the Soviet Union, you don't only have, let's say, conservative social democrats preventing the working class of reaching a revolutionary class consciousness. You also have ultra-leftist or utopianist positions that are producing, let's say, a will to transform reality that doesn't take into account the actual situation to an extent, and so it's producing defeats, and it's producing loss of energy and opportunity, loss of energy and of cadre for the movement. I'm going to be more clear about this just in the next few slides. So Lukács described this situation, the situation he was in 1922, as he said, on the one hand, there was a methodological cleavage in my thought between theory and practice. So a cleavage between theory and practice had emerged in his thought. While he supported ultra-leftist tendencies with regards to the international problems of the revolution, in the early 1920s, Lukács very much expected the revolution to take place very soon, and he was very much for an offensive political position of the communist parties and the workers' movement, so they should attempt to take power immediately. But in the case of the Hungarian party, precisely these kinds of policies in what was now a dictatorship in Hungary after the revolution is what he felt was most problematic. He was combating that. His a wing of the party was fighting against the attempt to treat the Hungarian situation as an immediately revolutionary one, and thus sacrificing members of the party and making a kind of revolutionary propaganda as if revolution was just around the corner, even if the situation was of a very reactionary nature. So history and class consciousness is born in the midst of this transitional period, as Lukács himself will say. So let's, before I go into the political stakes, let's see these three recoveries that history and class consciousness attempts. So the first of them, restore the dialectical within Marxism. Lukács is known for calling to this through what he terms the perspective of the totality, right? So here is a quote, Marxist dictum that the relations of production of every society form a whole is the methodological point of departure and the key to the historical understanding of social relations. And I wanted to quote this passage because it shows you that Lukács arrives at these apparently new concepts, or at least at this perspective, not simply out of his own original production. He's a very original thinker, but he's very closely in dialogue with the writings of Marx and of Engels. This quote comes from The Poverty of Philosophy, and so Lukács was aware that binary thinking, so positing a subject-object antagonism, was one of the key issues of the Marxism of the Second International, which was also resulting in a kind of determinist isolation of the economic factor as the ultimate determining factor of social phenomena. This was creating a series of issues in not only comprehending reality but also transforming it. So opposing individual to society. You have laws of society on the one hand and individual action on the other. Economic basis on the one hand and ideological phenomenon or ideas on the other. The Marxism of Lukács's time grasps these as inherent oppositions, whereas Lukács is trying to understand them as articulated in terms of a dialectic relationship. This is very important because by separating these things, this is a very clear message of history and class consciousness. If you are thinking in binary terms, you have already been politically defeated. A binary position, a binary perspective on reality is a contemplative one, is one where subject and object are separated by an abyss, and where exactly the Feuerbach thesis, the question of going beyond interpreting to also transform the world, becomes impossible. Basically, you become stuck in this position. So this is perhaps the first element of the dialectical, the totality, that overcomes binaries, antagonisms that are typical of bourgeois thinking. And a dialectical totality perspective on capitalist society, then, I would say there are three key elements. You understand social phenomena in their genesis. So, as a part of a historical process, in their necessary contradictions, and the necessary is important here, the contradictions aren't something you can simply eliminate. You keep the good side and eliminate the bad. And hence, in its transitory character, you approach social phenomenon from the standpoint of overcoming them, or the social phenomena of capitalist society from the standpoint of another society that overcomes these phenomena. So you approach them in their processuality, in their historical genesis. They're not simply given as a nature-like fixed substance. They are contradictory, and of course they can be transformed. And I love this quote from the 1919 version of What is Orthodox Marxism? So right here at the bottom of the page, without the dialectic, we are as lost in a labyrinth of disordered facts, impossible to put in order, and whose consideration is useless as orientation to our action. Lukács is very, very strongly in a very strong polemic with the idea that Marxism is this theory that doesn't that has been somehow surpassed by the facts, and capitalism is different than it was in Marx's time. We have to go from the facts to base our analysis. Lukács just says the facts themselves, how they present themselves, will give you especially in capitalist society, will give you no basis in and of themselves to orientate your actions. And why, right? Lukács is interested in explaining why that is. And here we come to the second, let's say, recuperation or recovery, the revolutionary in the dialectic. So again, this is another quote from the beginning, from what is Orthodox Marxism in its book version. Materialist dialectic is a revolutionary dialectic. Hence, the need to discover those features and definitions, both of theory and the ways of gripping the masses, which convert theory, the dialectical method, into a vehicle of revolution. The fact that you overcome the binary antagonisms means you can intervene, means you can transform this reality. These aspects of this perspective are intrinsically linked. It's not just a theoretical overcoming of bourgeois antagonistic thinking or binary thinking. It's also Lukács is writing this book as a pathway to transformative praxis. Now, perhaps one of the key aspects of history and class consciousness is that the book returns the critique of alienation to a central question of revolutionary critique. This is the older Lukács himself saying about his book. The term alienation doesn't appears only once in the book. But Lukács is already operating with this category. It is very clearly the problem of alienation is very clearly structuring the book, and I'll explain why we can conclude that further on. But the concept, of course, that Lukács coins, or at least expands and makes the center of his analysis, is the concept of reification. Reification, so the thingification, turning phenomena into things, reification, emerges as the generalization of the fetish character of the commodity to the form of manifestation of all social phenomena. So Lukács makes reification the central concept of his book to explain how what is the form of manifestation of phenomena from the world of production, of capitalist production, of commodity production and commodity exchange, how these forms, especially the commodity form, how they envelop every phenomena of contemporary society. And so Lukács wants to analyze through this concept the social roots and the structure of the following dialectical phenomenon. So I also tried here to give a useful definition of reification right here. And so bear with me, Lukács is trying to analyze how a contemplative attitude towards objects as things is concurrent with the thingification of the subject as a mere object by the world of those very things he or she has no control over. So let's go again. So Lukács is describing a phenomenon where our relationship to objects, but also to social relationships, gives them the form of things, of dead things we contemplate as simply given. And just like in the question of in the commodity form, we contemplate them from their quantitative, formal, isolated side. This contemplative attitude that makes things out of relationships in every object takes place at the same time that the subject becomes him or herself a thing, in terms of an isolated monad, an isolated atom. For Lukács, if you consider society as a collection of individuals, you are already under the spell of reification. That is a reified perspective on society. And again, and this is where alienation very clearly comes, this objectified subject that sees in objects only things, becomes a servant of the world of things that he or she has no control over. And Lukács finds the passages of Marx and Engels where this loss of control of the producers over their own over the products of their own labor, he finds these passages which very clearly refer to the problem of alienation. And so, just to recapitulate, to make a small recapitulation, phenomena appear. A reified phenomenon is a phenomenon that appears primarily as from its abstract formal, isolated and fragmented, quantifiable dimensions, right? Just as you consider a commodity in the process of commodity exchange, from the standpoint of exchange value, or from the standpoint of value, it appears as fragmented, formal, isolated, and quantifiable primarily. And you also fragment reality in just as many systems, just as there are commodities, each of which have their own immanent legality that can be studied in incredible detail. But as the more you study each phenomenon of society, let's say the state or the family or law, the more you study them from this reified perspective, the less you can grasp what their actual core, their actual substrate, as Lukács says. So if we can go back to this, but that's my best attempt to put reification in a nutshell, connecting it to alienation and commodity fetishism. But there is a third movement, and this is really key. Marxist dialectics, Lukács recovers the centrality of praxis to Marxist dialectics. This is not just a philosophical treatise. This is very important. And the overcoming of reification is not only a mental process or an intellectual operation. First, Lukács makes sure that we understand that the fact that things appear in this fashion, appear as fragmented, isolated, quantifiable phenomenon, both in relationships, things, complexes, is not simply, it is a necessary consequence of the capitalist mode of production. The capitalist mode of production reproduces itself in terms of the valorization of value, but it also constantly reproduces disappearance. It is a necessary appearance. And that's why you can't simply go beyond it once and for all and the problem is solved. You have to continuously be in a position to critique and transcend it. And that can only be done concretely in actual historical life. And so praxis becomes the central aspect of this overcoming of reification. You don't overcome this individually. You do so, and this to go back to what Professor Prasad was saying with the question of class. To Lukács, he's not only recovering the centrality of the class struggle and of revolutionary struggle to Marxism, but he's also arguing that to understand society, you have to do it from a specific class standpoint. The standpoint of the working class is the standpoint that allows you to cut through reification and hence to transform society to effectively transcend it. That is very important. It's not just an analysis; it's an analysis based an analysis of class relations and of a reified capitalist order. It's also an analysis based on a class standpoint. And so I found a quote here that I find is key in this aspect, that we understand it's not just a critique of reification, but a pathway towards revolutionary praxis that Lukács is aiming at. And it's the fact that you can never stop this effort against reification of its critique is a constant one until you overcome its social and historical roots. Oh, let me just mute this. So here, this Lukács puts this very well in this quote. For this reason, the task of orthodox Marxism, its victory over revisionism and utopianism, can never mean the defeat once and for all of false tendencies. It is an ever-renewed struggle against the insidious effects of bourgeois forms of comprehension on the thought of the proletariat. Marxist orthodoxy is no guardian of traditions. It is the eternally vigilant enunciator of the relation between the tests of the immediate present and the totality of the historical process. So, maybe a side note, these quotes I took from the English translation of History and Class Consciousness, but I changed one of the words here where it says that Marxist orthodoxy was the prophet of the relation between the immediate present and the totality of the historical process. This is not a bad translation into English, but it takes some liberties that can cause problematic interpretations. And so I would definitely, if I think it does, no translation into Hindi or any languages of the Indian subcontinent exist, I think, I would definitely suggest to do that one needs to be produced with reference to the original German. All right, and I'm heading towards the final part of my presentation, the political stakes of history and class consciousness. So as I was saying, his first impulse and also the central element in his conceptualization of reification is a critique of opportunism, of the Marxism of the Second International. Why I feel it's very important to talk about the political stakes of history and class consciousness, because just again to refer to what Professor Prasad was saying in the beginning, Lukács does not set out from the contradictions of capitalist society in general in an abstract sense, and he very much has a global perspective. Lukács has read Rosa Luxemburg and considered that the totality, for instance, applies also to the totality of the working class and the totality of the capitalist, we could say, world system at the time. He's most definitely not only considering the European working class or even in a single country. So he sets out from a specific situation, from the catastrophe of the war, as I was saying, and he is very much influenced by the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, her critique of reformism in social democracy. And I'll be able to go into Rosa Luxemburg's thought and how Lukács relates to her. For reasons of time, that would be another presentation. But he's aiming his critique against both Bernstein, so Edward Bernstein, the openly reformist wing of social democracy, but also against Kautsky, which represents, let's say, the centrist tendency that hasn't given up on revolution, but where it becomes very murky of how you actually get there. And so this is a quote from the 1919 version of what is Orthodox Marxism, where he says, while Bernstein openly declared that the final goal is nothing, the movement everything, Kautsky and his supporters attributed the final goal the role of a supernatural deity. They enshrined it into an alien sublimeness devoid of any immediate reality. So if Bernstein, on the one hand, said the revolution as a goal is not important, what's important is the struggle, and hence immediate reforms that can be achieved, and he thought wide-ranging reforms of capitalism could be achieved. Kautsky never gave up on the idea of a revolution, but had fell prey to a more deterministic perspective that economic relations will take us to socialism anyhow, and then the revolution. But then, when exactly is this moment where the revolution simply emerges is entirely unclear, and that's why Lukács compares it to this like extraterrestrial deity. The revolution is still there, but it's this sublime instance we can never reach for some reason, and it has nothing to do with immediate reality. So on the one hand, you have Bernstein saying we need an ethics, renewed individual ethics, so we can change things in the here and now, and deal with the react to the facts that have proven Marx wrong. Lukács rejects this as again relinquishing the revolutionary objective and also the standpoint of class. But he also critiques the absence of the revolution as an actual mediator for everyday actions and of the workers' movement. So what Lukács proposes is that from the standpoint of totality, is the fact of revolution no longer emerges for the workers' movement as an unexpected catastrophe, but as an awaited fulfillment to which they were internally and externally prepared as a dialectical turning point, as a possibility in every single instance of action. So Lukács most definitely wants the workers' movement to prepare and produce and act in a revolutionary manner in the here and now, but he says only the standpoint of totality allows the revolution to be present in every individual action, in every moment of struggle, as an ultimate orientation. But Lukács is not only fighting opportunism or reformist social democracy, he is very much also producing a critique of ultra-leftist tendencies. And while these become more of an issue, he will read, of course, Lenin's critique of left-wing childishness in about 1921. And Lukács was himself a target of Lenin's critique. Lukács has a text where he critiques parliamentarism in 1920 that Lenin himself will very harshly criticize as ultra-leftists. And so this had a direct impact on Lukács' own thinking. But what I find fascinating is the fact that even in the 1919 version of what is Orthodox Marxism, there is already a critique of ultra-leftist tendencies or of utopianism, in this case embodied in the critique of syndicalism. And this is also the first moment where Lukács actually uses the term alienation in his writings of his Marxist period. So it's in an immediately political context that the critique of alienation appears, but especially how there are also inadequate ways to try and overcome alienation. And that's what he talks about syndicalism. So I translated this quote here because remember Lukács was saying that we need dialectics not to lose ourselves in the labyrinth of facts, but he says in a way that syndicalism loses itself, quote, in the labyrinth of reactionary petty bourgeois actions. It does so because, quote, based on the same facts that are decisive for the workers' movement, syndicalists arrive at the total alienation of the bourgeois production order. Yet they remain at the level of mere negation, of abstract rejection, and necessarily fail to see a pathway leading into the future, into a new proletarian society. Syndicalists subject the institutions of bourgeois society, for instance parliamentarism, to a stark critique, but approach them in a singular, isolated, and abstract manner, and hence cannot oppose any alternative to it except the abstract revolutionary elan of workers without goals. So the critique of reification is already present here, even if he hasn't formulated the concept yet in 1919, and it emerges in the critique of both opportunist social democrats and kind of syndicalist ultra-leftists. So the genesis of the concept of reification is a political one. In their eye, the labor movement, the general strike, becomes in themselves an integral part of mythology. So syndicalists does decouple the labor movement, the general strike, from the broader historical process understood in its necessity, in the same way that the bourgeois understanding of the bourgeois production order that they say they so actually acutely criticize does. And I'm sorry, the translation here is not an excellent one, but basically he's saying when the strike and when revolutionary action becomes disconnected from the general historical process, you are thinking in a reified manner, isolating phenomena, regarding them in an abstract fashion. So this is key here. This is already in 1919, even before he wrote the reification chapter. What emerges, and now I'm running out of time, and so where my presentation wants to converge to is that by 1922, Lukács will not only conceptualize reification and how we overcome it, but the category of mediation becomes very central to his concept of the dialectic. And especially in political terms, organization emerges as the form of mediation. So here, just a quick contrast between what he wrote in 1919 and 1922. To the question of how a theoretical method can be revolutionary, Lukács replies in 1919, it is revolutionary in that it overcomes the difference between theory and practice, in that the mere fact of the correct mode of thought calls for a change in the object that evokes the thought, in that the consequent realization of the correct mode of thought results in the transformation of reality. Right? So Lukács talks about overcoming in the sin, and this is the translation of Aufhebung, overcoming the difference between theory and practice, so that theory realizes itself in transforming the world. And of course, there's a dialectic perspective here, but we don't see mediation makes no appearance. You overcome the duality almost by the fusion of theory and practice, subject and object. In 1922, however, Lukács has also got in, because of all the historical processes and experiences that I was commenting before, the category of mediation becomes central. So in 1922, Lukács writes the final chapter of History and Class Consciousness on organization. He writes that organization is the form of mediation between theory and practice. And as in every dialectical relationship, the terms of the relation only acquire concreteness and reality in and by virtue of this mediation. So this is a very important development in his own thought from 1919 to 1922. And this again reinforces the political character of his thinking, of his philosophical thinking from 1919, but also the development of that thinking. History and Class Consciousness culminates in an essay on party organization, or on a theory of party organization. This is not a coincidence. If we go back to the structure of History and Class Consciousness, we could say...
Dr.
Yes.
May I remind you that you have... you can take last 5 minutes so that
yes.
you can have discussion. Yeah.
Yes, I will conclude. Thank you. History and Class Consciousness goes, we could say, from theory to practice. He starts with what is orthodox Marxism. Reification, the chapter on reification, is in the middle as the central phenomena we have to overtake, and he ends with a chapter on political organization. And now to finalize, we cannot forget what I'm calling Lukács's warning. The party itself can become reified, can fall prey to reified practices. This chapter on the party is quoted a lot. There's this formulation that what the party is also a totality in itself, and hence before its individual members who have to submit their full personality through iron discipline and total commitment to the party to overcome the individualism of capitalist society. But this is what's mostly quoted. What is forgotten is that Lukács warns us very clearly that the party itself can also fall prey to reified practices, reified structures. And this is the quote I want to end this presentation with. The requirements of purposeful action also compel the party to introduce the division of labor to a considerable degree, and this inevitably invokes the dangers of ossification, bureaucratization, and corruption. The Communist Party would be a fantastical utopian island of the blessed reposing in the ocean of capitalism if its progress were not constantly attended by such dangers. So, by the fact that the Communist Party is inserted in this capitalist reality, that its members are members and producers of this reality, it's not a happy island where once you enter, you become clairvoyant and you go beyond reification. It's exactly the opposite. If the party is an instrument to overcome reification, this is where the book culminates. It's also an instance within which you also have to fight reification and refined tendencies in a permanent manner. So this is where I want to end. with the notion of a permanent struggle against reification that takes place through the mediation of organization in a party of the working class, from the standpoint of the working class, but also one that is a permanent effort until you overcome the capitalist basis of reification. So thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward. Thank you for your patience, and looking forward to the discussion. And
sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Victor, for laying out all the key arguments of George Lukács. In a way, you started off with saying that he appeals, or his book actually goes back to returning to all the key thinkers, to start with Hegel, and then engaging with Rosa Luxemburg, with Lenin, with Engels, with a whole set of those theorists. Okay. But I think the way you put it in terms of what are those three recoveries, I think those three recoveries are about explaining theory and method, theory and praxis, and how Lukács was able to actually bring in those political stakes. What was fascinating was, I think, in that recovery, those three ideas. One is, I think, dialectics in Marxism, or in terms of the dialectic totality. The second, I think, in terms of, revolutionary, the idea of revolutionary in the dialectics, okay, particularly explaining very carefully the reification and how Lukács himself actually was able to, overcome that kind of conceptual kind of, clarity. And the third one, of course, is in terms of Marxian dialectics. That was very fascinating to look at, to bring back centrality of class and class struggle and whole set of things. However, I think towards the end of your presentation, I think what you were able to highlight was those political stakes, which are very critical today. Okay, the way we need to look at totality of capitalist society. I think that's what today we are all trying to look at, how global capitalism actually is operating, in a sense that the possibilities, okay, of each nation state independently treading different paths, and then how do we actually see larger kind of a picture that is also immanent in the relations of production and relations of class and whole set of things. Okay, and the point that Lukács was trying to emphasize about mediation, which Marx himself was trying to emphasize in terms of how class is central, and how economic relations are simultaneously, social relations, political relations. Okay, so those are some of the ideas. But I'll just stop with, I think, what you said in terms of that reification of party. I think that's where I'm sure Comrade Sitaram Yechury was trying to highlight the relation between individual and that of the party or organization, and how those things, because I think we don't live, of course, in those utopias and islands, and how those things actually matter. But I think I just want to quote one thing from that book that I think is central. That is, Lukács actually says capitalist production, under its impact of continuous connected process, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capitalist relation itself. And that's what I think, on the one hand, and of course, it also reproduces the labor on the other. And that actually summarizes what, Lukács was saying. It is about producing certain kind of class relations is what I think we need to understand. And now I request Sitaram Yechury to actually, highlight his observations and probably what he wants to actually read from this book for today's context. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Purerndra. And I think Victor gave us a very comprehensive presentation of the content of this book. But there are only one or two observations I'd like to make before we actually start discussing reification or alienation and in the present context in which we are existing. Because the context was as important for Lukács as for many Marxists, always, but Lukács particularly, because this entire book, 100 years ago, when it was published, was actually battling the conscious reality, the actual reality in the working class movement at that point of time, the failed revolutions that were happening, the degeneration in the Second International, and how do you get back to intensifying the class struggle. So for that purpose, it was necessary to go back into Marxism in terms of talking about the basic dialectics, I mean, which of course Lukács goes towards Hegel also to many ways. That's a different matter because he was an extremely complex mind, a complex phenomenon, I would say. I mean, who was actually growing by the minute. I mean, like every one of us does, but we are not conscious. But he was. I mean, in the sense that he used to precisely note down what all the changes that were going through his own thinking and what is the actual reality. So Lukács' objective was to actually change this reality in a revolutionary direction. Towards that, these recoveries, what you were talking about, or these interventions, of bringing back these methods, etc., these therefore had to be put in a place whereby the totality of the situation had to be made supreme. It is not the compartmentalization, like was the tendency then, and that's how revisionism begins. The compartmentalization of the different subjects where economics becomes dominant, where the economics is the area of your class struggle as it is seen. And that is one seminal contribution of Lukács, is that the class struggle is there in every other discipline, every other phenomenon, it's there in the totality. And unless you grasp this totality, you don't really grasp the need and how to change this reality. And that, I think, was one of the things, that is, to see it as a totality, to see it as a continuity in terms of dialectics from Hegel onwards, and to also see that it's a dynamic situation. Now, often the example of a billiards game is given, I mean, how the balls keep changing their positions. Lukács adds that it's not only balls changing positions, but also changing character. At each position, you are changing, and unless you are in a position to actually comprehend that, to intervene, your intervention doesn't happen. And that is where consciousness becomes an important element. Class consciousness comes in precisely because you have to intervene in this dynamic situation where positions are different, changing, and also the characters are changing. How does this consciousness, that is where Lenin, I think, only put it in a nutshell. I'm just racing through because of the lack of time. Lenin actually put it in a nutshell in saying, without revolutionary theory, there's no revolutionary practice. So praxis as a combination of theory and practice, when neither becomes the dominant one, I mean, they both coexist together, which is a classic definition of praxis in that sense, if you look at it. I mean, that is in itself is the part of the class consciousness that the proletariat has to absorb, evolve. And it is that the consciousness which actually becomes also lays the seeds which Lukács want for bureaucratism, for elitism, which comes in, which assists or breeds the process of reification within the Communist Party itself. The reification within the Communist Party itself comes in because of you have this concept that without, let's say, revolutionary theory, there's no revolutionary practice. So those who are repositories of this theory are the elite. And because the economic aspect is the one that dominates under capitalism, the whole work of Marxist capital, and it is because of that economic domination under capitalism that you find that the distancing of other disciplines away from it and this compartmentalization that is taking place in the process of overcoming that economic domination under socialism. You require an economic structures that have to be set up, which lays the basis for bureaucratism to develop. Now, all this, it also leads up to that process of reification within the Communist Party that he wants of, but he unfortunately doesn't go into the details. And I wish he had spent some time trying to tell us, and maybe because of the political conditions he was living in, he was already hounded by the Hungarian party. He already had to go through various capitulations in his own positions, in his own life, and ended up being a Stalinist at one point of time, ended up finally denouncing Stalinism at the end of his life. So, I mean, these are also of a complex reality in which Lucas existed. So that we'll have to discount and go in. But I wish he had spent some more time on how this process of reification within the Communist Party can happen. But has to be tackled. But then I would say that in the material sense, alienation, originally going back to Marx, alienation in that sense will have to, there is a fundamental basis on which more work needs to be done in this regard, because eventually the origins of much of the fundamental concepts on alienation that were thrown up come from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Now, this 1844 EP, so to speak, economic and philosophical manuscript also has a history. And that history is something that needs to be internalized by Marxists today. Why is it that Marx moved to Paris? Why is it that he started studying political economy? In his entire critique of Hegel's philosophy of the right of law, depends on the translation of it. Remember, at that point of time, there was a group called the Young Hegelians. And the Young Hegelians, Feuerbach was the head of it. And they were talking in terms of the revolution, in terms of the revolution of the mind, of the consciousness, of separating the influence of religion from your thinking. And that is the foundations for the revolution. Marx, by which time, has already been developing his entire concept of saying that the Hegelian dialectics, which talk of the pathway from heaven to earth, in reality, it is the other way around. It's from earth to heaven. It doesn't descend on you, but it rises from here. So the consciousness, the material foundations of consciousness, is something that he comes to the conclusion. And then he says a very seminal thing in that thesis, that the civil society that Hegel describes, the term civil society, which has a different connotation today, but the civil society, the Hegelian civil society, he describes as the unfolding of the absolute. Marx comes to the conclusion saying that it is not the unfolding of the absolute, but the anatomy of civil society lies in political economy. These are very seminal, this seminal conclusion he came to and moves to Paris to study political economy. So from philosophy, he moves to political economy, greatly assisted by Engels, who moves from political economy to philosophy. And it is this combination that finally produces, that's a different part of it. But the process of alienation that emerges from the economic and political, the reason why I'm talking of alienation is in today's world, particularly in today's world that we are facing today, this is a practical problem for us of how to internalize the struggle against alienation in the struggle against the system itself. You have in today's, what is the change today? And this is something which needs to be properly analyzed by Marxists the world over, that unlike the stage of imperialism that Lenin had analyzed, saying that the last stage of capitalism, final stage of capitalism, the eve of social revolution, today's imperialism is dominated by international finance capital. It's not the finance capital of different imperialist centers. So the inter-imperialist contradictions of the nature that existed at the time of the development of imperialism of Lenin have been superseded, transcended by the emergence of international finance capital, where you have international finance capital acting as a hegemon today and not inter-imperialist rivalries leading to world wars. In that situation, the entire process of scientific advances and the domination, the hegemony of international finance capital, that itself is defined as a qualitatively different phase of capitalist development and of imperialism. Now, alienation under these circumstances cannot just be a reproduction of the concept of alienation or reification that we are talking of in an earlier stages of capitalism. Now, what is the stage whereby you have development of technology to the levels of artificial intelligence, where you're leading human beings to actually reduce them as robots in a system, and your dependence on this entire infrastructure, on this entire technology, and an IT worker or a software engineer today, who is the owner and who is the power that he's fighting against? What is this? What is his struggle against? Is that capitalist tangible? It's international finance flowing all over, which is about 12 times the multiple of your actual real world GDP. Now that is dictating your entire dynamics of the world economy today. So alienation in this situation means what? Now, this sort of a situation also produces a higher degree of human exploitation. Now, higher degree of human exploitation, you have global protests on the rise, you have global alienation that is there on the rise, but the protests against this, the movements against this, movements that are growing against this, in order that they should not reach the level of challenging the rule of capital itself, leads to a political implication, a political compulsion, where you find in country after country there is a political rightward shift. What does this rightward shift mean? The rightward shift means that is the growing discontent among the people should not find expression of a revolutionary form of an overthrow of the rule of capital in a particular country, but anywhere in the world, etc. If that has to be stopped, the growing unity of the people in struggles has to be disrupted. And the best way to disrupt is in order to rouse passions, which are either xenophobic, which are racist, which are in our country communal, which are this thing, or divide the people so that their unity doesn't get strengthened in order to challenge the rule of capital. The global rightward shift you find in politics today has a lot to do with the current situation of this phase of imperialist development under the domination of international finance capital. Now, in this situation, with this political rightward shift, while alienation, of course, is deepening, in a much more exponential sense, but at the same time, in this situation, you find another seminal work of Lukács, I think, is relevant and extremely relevant, and that is the destruction of reason, where he actually dissects philosophically how the spread of irrationality, the spread of irrationalism is the mainstay of imperialist class rule. So in the phase of what he said then at that point of time, in this new phase of imperialism led by the international finance capital, I think this work assumes a greater seminal importance, because the essence is what? That if you attack rationalism in philosophy, if you attack reason, then you are robbing the consciousness of the people from actually moving towards a sharpening class consciousness. Instead, you are creating a consciousness whereby reality can never be understood in its complete form, which is what irrationalism is. It requires the divine intervention, and it's only the faith. Faith is the basis on which you can comprehend the total reality, Because rationalism is what? At no point can you comprehend the entire reality. What you do not comprehend, you pursue scientifically in order to try and understand that phenomenon. Irrationalism instead tells you you can never comprehend. Therefore, your only recourse is faith, blind faith. And blind faith is the mainstay for the rise of all right-wing movements, whether it's in Turkey today, whether it's in Brazil today, or it was under, let's hope, Lula coming, some change will happen. But whether in any of these right-wing societies or in India today, it is the assault on reason and rationality that sustains this right-wing movement. And therefore, your alienation gets even deepened because you are creating a new self, which is you're creating a new self in the sense it is what is, when fashionable nowadays to call it, a post-truth society, where your basic lived reality has got nothing to do with your levels of consciousness and conscious activity and absorption or your perception, and perception of your consciousness. So that is why in this reality, Lukács becomes important in order to understand how this process of alienation or reification has to be combated. But a lot of work has to be done on this. I mean, to take in these elements, like Lukács took in those elements when the Second International was decaying. I mean, 100 years ago, exactly. But in today's circumstances, with this rise of the new phase of imperialism, with this rise of a new phase of a Cold War that has already been set in, with this new phase of global domination and US imperialist hegemony, and with this new phase of the hegemony of international finance capital, running your life, my life, everybody's life today. In this situation, the revolutionary praxis that has to come with a appropriate revolutionary theory, which will have to be, which is being worked out. I mean, each Communist Party in each country is working out on the basis of their concrete reality there. But this is something which is a very, very formidable struggle in this present world today. So that is where I think Lukács's history in class consciousness, the concepts that he introduces, they're not so much the concrete realities because they have completely changed. The concepts that he introduces there to bring back the question of the supremacy of the totality and not compartmentalization. The question of this bringing back the dialectics of change, in the sense of trying to comprehend the reality in its totality through the process of dialectics. These are important elements that are today very, very relevant for us to focus on and work together. That's why, as far as my party is concerned, we are conscious. We are very conscious of the fact that Marxism is actually a creative science. Concrete analysis of concrete conditions. As Lenin said, is a living essence of dialectics. As these conditions are changing, if your analysis doesn't keep pace, you fall into the same trap at decay that Lukács has been warning. And I think this is something, it's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing exercise. We're trying to work this out, but I think these are the challenges of the international communist movement also. And each communist party in their own country, in their concrete conditions, will have to come to terms with and grapple with this reality and work out the manner in which this reification can be overcome, not only in society, but also its penetration into the party will have to be not merely resisted, but combated. And that combating of that is something that will have to be worked out in the concrete conditions of each country and each party. I think these are some of the initial observations I have.
Thank you so much. Because I think the way you try to, bring in a lot of ideas actually goes beyond the historical context that Lukács was trying to actually talk in 100 years back. But how significant this book is, I think, is something that you are able to really bring it out. But also, the 2 points about finance capital and assault on reason and rationality, I think those are very, very interesting kind of insights that provokes a lot of readers to go back and now reconnect with Lucas's book.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I wish they'll do it. I wish they do it.
I'm sure. I think that these are two very fascinating kind of ideas. But I think the way you are talking about also, it's not just about class consciousness, but also we need to understand alienation, I think, much more deeply. The way it is unfolding, capitalism actually is unfolding itself. Veera Garu, I think, are there any questions? Because I think we are already close to 7:25 already.
There are not. You can conclude.
Okay. All right. So, do you want to have any final comment, Victor?
If I can, very quickly, because this was an incredible intervention by Comrade Sitaram, and I just wanted to say a few words about very important points that he raised. I like very much this idea that the central problem in history and class consciousness is finding the position from which to comprehend reality in order to transform it. So it's not simply saying you comprehend it and then transform. What is the position you have to be in terms of concepts, in terms of your political situation? What is your organization? How are you intervening in the world so that you can comprehend and then transform? I like this very much. And of course, we had a very, very interesting analysis of how this of the relevance of the book for today. And this is what I wanted to comment a little bit. In terms of what is the position, the question of the phenomenon of alienation in political life and how does that apply to the political party, to the Communist Party more specifically, or to revolutionary organizations in general. This is a project that I have to somehow go deeper into this question. Sitaram, I hope we can be in dialogue, because I'm sure you have much more experience on this than I do, but I do feel it's a phenomenon that hasn't been sufficiently exploited. And in terms of how does it apply today, I feel that the revolutionary organizations that exist, or at least the left-wing oppositional organizations that exist, are either stuck in an abstract opposition that condemns this reality, even if it's not even a party, even if it's an anarchist movement, a complete condemnation of this reality that remains in this abstract kind of position and cannot really intervene, cannot lay down roots in the movement. Or on the other hand, it's so inserted into politics in the conventional sense in the given institutions that it becomes, in a way, a slave to its own rhythms, to its own forms of functioning, and can't produce an alternative that goes beyond it. And so again, if we need to find a position in order to comprehend and transform reality, I feel more and more that we have to find these mediations. What is the mediation that allows us to make practical politics within the given circumstances, but a politics that produces actively and in everyday life the transcendence of this order as it exists? To me, that's why I'm centering this consideration of, alienation in politics on the category of mediation. We need to find the forms, the ways of struggle, the forms of praxis that allow us to intervene in the world as it is now, with the complexity that you detailed, but also in a way that transcends it. And now, becoming more concrete, to just finish in some topics you raised, alienation now, as what is its contemporary facet? What is it? What is the contemporary manifestation of alienation? I find it very interesting that you connected also to the role of finance in global capitalism. I'd give one example is how we've been facing the question of environmental destruction and environmental catastrophe. Because in a way, never has humanity shaped the world so profoundly and been aware of its own role in shaping the planetary weather systems, of humanity becoming a geological force. And never have we felt so powerless to reshape that relationship to nature, the metabolism to nature. To me, that's like that's the universalization of this process of alienation, right? We shape the world, that we're very aware that we do that, but we can't control how we do it. So to me, that's a manifestation. And of course, the global right-wing shift is in direct dialogue with the condition of alienation as it presents today. I feel the right, at least the right-wing movements that became successful globally are reacting to this condition of alienation because I don't know what you think in this case, Sitaram. They provide answers to questions that this condition of alienation raises. They have an oppositional, an apparently oppositional stance with regard to reality as it currently is, right? They want to demask media. They want to tell you to go beyond just the appearance of things, see the conspiracies behind, the elites manipulating the state of things. But they produce responses that remain in the level of this alienation. They produce racist, they produce individualist, destructive, anti-feminist responses, and propose a regression in many ways. And of course, now this global right is in a pact with neoliberal politics, which is also a very reified perspective. Just the last idea, you're very right to connect the destruction of reason to history and class consciousness. These works, there is a continuity between them. The struggle against fascism became the driver of Lukács's existence as of the end of the 20s. So after the cycle that I approached, and the interesting thing is he produces the destruction of reason after the war. He struggles against fascism, without tiring, from the end of the 20s until the end of the war. But then he produces this book and he says the problem has not been solved. The roots of the problem have not been eliminated. That's why he publishes the destruction of reason. And of course, we're seeing that how he was proven right in that sense. Yeah, so thanks very much for this incredible commentary and for the opportunity to have presented history and class consciousness with you. I'd love to discuss my book with this audience, and I'm open to other invitations. But again, thanks again for the invitation.
Good. Looking forward for further interactions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for Manchi Pustakam organizers actually for bringing in two eminent competent speakers to actually reflect on Lucas's book, and also how do we actually take his ideas forward and actually reconnect with a lot of these things globally in terms of trying to understand global capitalism. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity also to actually carefully, look at all these ideas. I look forward to actually more of these discussions through this Manchi Pustakam. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, friends. I request all the viewers to subscribe to Manchi Pustakam so that it will reach much more arenas. And I thank Victor for his offer to discuss his book. So we'll connect after some time. Definitely we will take it up on this channel. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Sitaram Garu.
Thank you.
Okay. See you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, bye everyone. Challenge is about dialectical mediation. Yeah.
Exactly.
See you everyone.
Yeah.
Right.
Bye.